I didn't plan on working at an aquarium. It just happened. I needed a job, something that wouldn't suck the life out of me. And when I saw the ad, night shift assistant needed, it seemed perfect. No customers, no crowds, just me and the fish. Easy. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. The first day felt like walking into a whole other world. The tanks glowed with soft, blue light, casting ripples on the walls. Everything smelled faintly of salt water. There was this soothing hum from the filtration systems, almost like the building itself was alive and breathing. The manager, a guy named Mike, gave me the basic rundown. Feed the fish, clean the glass, monitor the equipment. He seemed normal, if not a little distracted. But there was one thing he said that stuck with me. Stay out of the back room, he told me, almost as an afterthought. His voice dropped, just a little. That tank doesn't need maintenance. Don't worry about it. I laughed it off. Got it. No problem. But as the night went on, I kept thinking about that back room. The door was plain, unmarked, blending into the wall like it was trying to hide. It didn't look special. It didn't look important. But the way Mike had said it, it was like he didn't want to talk about it at all. Still, I had other things to focus on. The night shift was quiet, peaceful even. I walked past the glowing tanks, watching schools of fish swirl in perfect patterns. Some of them darted toward the glass like they recognized me. Others hovered near the bottom, silent and still, like they were waiting for something. Around midnight, I noticed it for the first time. A sound, soft, barely audible, coming from somewhere near the back. It wasn't the usual hum of the filters or the bubbling of water. This was different. It sounded wet, like something dragging across the floor. I froze, straining to hear more. But just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and cold. I shook it off. Maybe it was the pipes or a pump kicking on somewhere. It was an old building, after all. Things creak. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed little things. A faint, sour smell near the back hallway that seemed to linger, no matter how many times I passed it. A couple of the fish tanks were dimmer than I remembered, like the light wasn't quite reaching them anymore. And then there were the employees. Most of them avoided me, not in a rude way, but in a deliberate one. Conversations stopped when I walked into a room. When I tried to ask one of the senior staff about the back room, she just shook her head. "Don't ask about it," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward the floor. I tried to laugh it off again. "Come on, what's back there? A giant squid? A shark?" She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, muttering something under her breath. By the time my shift ended, I couldn't get the place out of my head. That door at the back, the faint noises, the way everyone acted like it didn't exist. It all felt wrong. But I told myself I was overthinking it. "It's just a job," I muttered on my way out. "Nothing weird. Just a job." But as I walked past the tanks one last time, something caught my eye. A shadow, quick and sharp, darting across the water in a tank near the back hallway. I stopped, staring into the glass. The tank was empty. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, a sharp chill running down my spine. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as if the whole aquarium was holding its breath. I took a step back, my eyes still locked on the glass. Nothing moved. I left quickly after that, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, and I had a feeling the answers were behind that door. I couldn't shake the feeling when I left that night. The image of that shadow in the tank kept playing in my mind. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my imagination was running wild. That's what I told myself. But when I showed up for my next shift, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The aquarium looked the same: dim blue lights, faint smell of salt water, tanks glowing in the darkness. But there was this heaviness in the air, like the kind you feel right before a storm. Mike wasn't there when I arrived, which wasn't unusual, but I noticed the other employees were acting strange. They avoided me completely now, like I wasn't even in the room. Normally, the night crew at least said hello or gave a nod, but tonight it was like I was invisible. And then there was Sarah. She'd been working there for years, one of the senior staff members. I always thought she seemed friendly enough, but that night, I caught her standing near one of the tanks, mumbling under her breath. Her back was to me, and at first I thought she was talking to someone. But when I got closer, I realized she was alone. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet room. She didn't respond. She just kept muttering, her voice low and shaky, like she was chanting something. I stepped closer, and that's when she turned around. Her eyes looked hollow, almost glazed over, like she hadn't slept in days. She stared at me for a moment, her lips still moving silently, before she whispered, "Don't go near it. Don't let it see you." And then she walked away, leaving me frozen in place. What did she mean? As the hours went by, things only got stranger. While cleaning one of the tanks, I noticed the lights flickering overhead. It wasn't the usual buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. It was erratic, like the building itself was trying to tell me something. First, I ignored it. I had a job to do after all. But then I started noticing other things. One of the smaller tanks had been fine earlier in the night, but now it looked cloudy, like something was swirling inside the water. I leaned closer, trying to see what was causing it, when suddenly, the glass made a loud creak. I jumped back, my heart racing. The glass looked fine, no cracks, no signs of damage. But for a moment, I swore I saw something move just beneath the surface. Not a fish, not anything I recognized. It was gone before I could focus on it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the stress of working late. But as the night went on, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Everywhere I went, it felt like eyes were on me. Not the friendly curiosity of the fish in the tanks. This was different. It was colder, sharper, like whatever was watching me didn't want me there. At one point, I was checking the filters near the back hallway when I heard it again. That same wet, dragging noise. It was louder this time, echoing faintly through the corridor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "It's just the pipes," I whispered to myself. "It's nothing," but deep down I knew it wasn't just the pipes. The sound grew louder, then stopped abruptly. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. And yet, it didn't feel empty. By the time I made it back to the main room, I was on edge. My shifts at the aquarium had always been quiet, almost boring. But tonight, every sound seemed sharper, every shadow seemed darker. I was about to head to the staff room for a break when I noticed something strange. One of the doors to a maintenance closet was slightly open. It had been shut earlier, I was sure of it. I hesitated, staring at the dark crack between the door and the frame. It felt like something was standing just on the other side, waiting for me to come closer. My gut told me to walk away, but I couldn't. Slowly, I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. It was empty, just a few buckets, mops, and cleaning supplies. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. A sudden chill washed over me, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I spun around, but the closet was still empty. That's when I heard Sarah's voice again, faint and distant, whispering from somewhere nearby, "Don't let it see you." By the end of my shift, I was exhausted. I tried to convince myself that everything I'd seen and heard had a logical explanation. But as I clocked out and walked past the back hallway, I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting to that door, the locked one. For a moment, I thought I saw something move behind it, a flicker of shadow, quick and unnatural. I hurried out of the building, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I stepped into the cool night air, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. And in the silence, I realized something. Whatever was in that tank, it wasn't just staying behind that door. I didn't want to go back the next night. I told myself it was just the long hours, or maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong with that place, and it wasn't just the creaky pipes or dim lighting. Still, I needed the paycheck. So, I showed up, telling myself I'd keep my head down and stay focused on the work. No distractions, no lingering near the back hallway. It didn't take long for things to go sideways. When I clocked in, the aquarium was even quieter than usual. The soft hum of the tanks seemed muffled, like the air itself had grown heavier. The lights, which normally gave the place a calming glow, seemed dimmer somehow. And the smell, it was stronger tonight. That same faint, sour odor from the back hallway, only now it seemed to follow me wherever I went. It clung to my clothes, to the walls, as if it had seeped into the very air. I passed Sarah as I started my rounds. She didn't look at me this time, didn't even acknowledge my presence. She was hunched over near one of the smaller tanks, staring into the water like she was in a trance. "Sarah?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. I hesitated, my hand tightening around the clipboard I was holding. For a moment, I thought about walking away, but something about the way she was standing, completely still except for the slight movement of her lips, made me stop. "Sarah, are you okay?" This time she turned. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale. She looked like she hadn't eaten or slept in days. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "It doesn't want you here." Before I could say anything, she walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the room. I tried to shake it off, but my nerves were already shot. As I continued my rounds, things only got stranger. One of the large tanks near the entrance had always been my favorite. It was filled with vibrant fish, their scales shimmering like jewels under the soft blue lights. But tonight it was different. The water was murky, almost black, as if something had stirred up the sediment at the bottom. I could barely see the fish, but what I did see made my stomach drop. They were pressed against the glass, motionless, their eyes wide and unblinking. It was like they were staring at something or someone just beyond the glass. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look, when the lights above me flickered violently. For a split second, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the fish were gone. The tank was empty. I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. It didn't make sense. They couldn't just disappear. I scanned the room, hoping for some kind of explanation, but all I saw was my own reflection in the glass. My own pale, terrified face staring back at me. As the night dragged on, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Every sound, no matter how small, made me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just stress or exhaustion, but deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place. And then there was the maintenance closet. I passed it on my way to check the filters, and once again, the door was open. Not wide open, just enough to make me stop. The air around it felt colder than before, biting against my skin. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the doorknob. "Don't let it see you." Sarah's voice echoed in my head, but I ignored it. I reached for the door, pulling it open slowly. It was empty just like the last time, But this time, something was different. The mop bucket in the corner had been tipped over, its contents spilled across the floor. The water shimmered under the faint light, but it wasn't clear. It was red. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but the metallic smell in the air told me otherwise. Blood. Before I could process what I was seeing, a loud crash echoed from the back hallway. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The sound had come from the direction of the locked door. I wanted to run, to grab my things and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself walking toward the back hallway, each step heavier than the last. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath in the dim light. The door loomed ahead of me, its surface scratched and worn, like something had been clawing at it from the inside. I stopped a few feet away, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, from behind the door, I heard it, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by a sharp, wet scraping noise, like nails dragging across metal. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I barely made it to the staff room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely lock the door. The growl, that scraping sound, it was still echoing in my head. I leaned against the wall, struggling to catch my breath. The room felt smaller than before, the walls closing in. The faint hum of the aquarium equipment usually calmed me, but tonight, it only made the silence feel heavier. Couldn't go back out there. Not yet. But as I stood there, trying to steady myself, something caught my attention. The doorknob was moving. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it turned, just a little. My chest tightened as I stared at it, frozen in place. Someone was on the other side. "Mike," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The knob turned again, this time with more force. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The knob fell still, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, muffled by the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't Mike's either. It was something else entirely, low, guttural, and wrong. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, but eventually, the whispers stopped. The room felt colder now, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I grabbed my bag and decided I'd had enough. I needed to leave. But as I stepped into the hallway, I realized something was different. The lights were off. The entire aquarium was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the tanks. The shadows they cast on the walls twisted and moved, almost like they were alive. I clutched my flashlight, the beam trembling as I pointed it ahead of me. Every step echoed in the silence, louder than it should have been. I needed to get out. I reached the main room, the exit just a few steps away, when I stopped. Something wasn't right. The tank near the entrance, the one that had been empty earlier, was no longer empty. I froze, my flashlight shaking as I aimed it at the water. Something was moving inside. At first, I thought it was a fish, but as the shape came into view, I realized it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, its form shifting and writhing beneath the surface, as though it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. Long, sinewy limbs reached out, pressing against the glass, leaving streaks of something dark and oily behind. And then it stopped, turned. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew it was looking at me. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. And then it smiled. Not with its mouth, it didn't have one, but with its eyes. Dark, endless eyes that seemed to pull me in, wrapping around my mind like a suffocating fog. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was back in the hallway, stumbling toward the exit. But no matter how far I went, the aquarium seemed to stretch on endlessly, the doors always just out of reach. The growling started again, louder this time, echoing all around me. I turned a corner, and there it was, the locked door. It was wide open now. The light inside flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The smell hit me first, rotting, metallic, and overwhelming. And then I saw it, the tank. It was enormous, far larger than it should have been, the water inside dark and murky. Something moved beneath the surface, but I couldn't make out its shape. All I could see were the eyes, dozens of them, staring back at me, unblinking and alive. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the darkness. And then, from somewhere deep inside the tank, I heard it again. That growl. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling crawling through my body, wrapping around my mind. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts. Images, sounds, emotions, all flooding my mind at once. I saw things I couldn't understand, memories that weren't mine, places that couldn't exist. And through it all, one message became clear. Leave, before it's too late. I don't remember how I got out of there. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. My bag was still clutched in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But even as I stood there, gasping for air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced back at the building, its windows dark and empty. And then, in the faint glow of the exit sign, I saw it. A shadow standing just inside the door, its form twisting and writhing like the thing in the tank. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps lost in the silence behind me. I ran, faster than I thought I could, my breath sharp and burning in my chest. The cold night air hit my face, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. No matter how far I got from the aquarium, I could still feel it, watching, waiting, like it was pulling me back. By the time I reached my apartment, my legs were trembling, and my mind felt wrong, twisted, like my own thoughts weren't my own anymore. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, bolting it, doing anything I could to feel safe. But the silence in my apartment wasn't any better. It was in the silence that I heard it. The whisper, faint, almost like it was coming from inside my own head. It wasn't a voice. It was more like a feeling, creeping into my mind and wrapping itself around my thoughts. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Come back. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on my couch, every light in my apartment turned on, staring at the door like it might open on its own. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd quit, ignore the paycheck, and never step foot in that building again. But the next night, I found myself standing outside the aquarium anyway. I didn't want to be there. Every part of me screamed to run, to get as far away as I could. But something stronger pulled me back. A weight pressing down on me, urging me to go inside. The door opened with a soft creak, and the familiar smell of salt water filled the air. But this time, the sourness was stronger. It made my stomach turn, thick and nauseating. The aquarium was dark. The tanks were dim, their glow muted like the life had been drained from them. Shadows clung to the corners, heavy and still. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I wasn't alone. I could feel it before I saw it. That creeping, suffocating presence pressing against my chest. Sarah was standing by one of the tanks. Her back was to me, her head tilted to the side like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw her reflection in the glass. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with terror. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, but the expression on her face said it all. She was terrified. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed against her, she turned. Her scream was deafening, echoing through the empty room. She grabbed my arm, her grip ice cold and impossibly strong. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's awake now." And then she let go, stumbling backward and disappearing into the shadows. The room felt colder now, the air thick with something I couldn't see but could feel all around me. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked out the door. But instead, I found myself moving toward the back hallway. The locked door was open again, the faint light inside flickering like a dying flame. The sour smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. I hesitated, my body trembling, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped inside. The tank was massive, far larger than I'd realized before. The water inside was dark and still, rippling faintly as though something was moving just beneath the surface. I stood there, frozen, staring into the abyss. And then it moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a faint, shifting blur. But as it rose closer to the surface, I saw it. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things twisted together, forming shapes that defied logic. Eyes, limbs, mouths, all shifting and blending into each other, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to stay steady. The light hit the tank, and for the briefest moment, the thing stopped moving. And then it turned. It looked at me, not with its eyes. Those were scattered and shifting, never staying in one place for long. But I felt it. It was looking at me, and then it spoke, not with words, but with thoughts, filling my mind with images and sounds I couldn't understand. I saw flashes of people, faces I recognized from the aquarium, staring into the tank, their expressions blank and lifeless. I saw myself, standing there, my eyes wide and empty. It was showing me what it wanted. I stumbled back, my head spinning, but I couldn't take my eyes off the tank. The thing inside was still moving, its form growing larger, pressing against the glass like it was trying to escape. The air around me felt heavier, colder, like it was pushing me down. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then I saw it. The glass was cracking. Thin lines spidered across the surface, growing wider with each passing second. The water inside began to churn, the thing's movements growing more frantic. I turned to run, but the door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. The room was shaking now, the sound of the cracking glass growing louder and louder. And then, with a deafening crash, the tank shattered. I hit the floor, shards of glass cutting into my arms and legs as the freezing water poured over me. For a moment, everything was silent, and then I heard it. A sound so low and guttural it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. I looked up, and there it was. It towered over me, its form shifting and writhing, never staying the same for more than a second. Its eyes, dozens of them, locked onto mine, and I felt my mind unraveling, like it was pulling me apart piece by piece. I tried to crawl away, but my body wouldn't move. It was inside my head now, filling my thoughts with its voice. You belong to me. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was lying on the cold, wet floor, the creature towering over me. Its shifting form seemed to stretch into every corner of the room, its eyes burning into my mind, pulling me apart piece by piece. I thought it was over, but then I woke up outside. The night was cold and still, the smell of salt water and rot still clinging to my skin. I was lying on the pavement near the entrance to the aquarium, my clothes soaked, my arms and legs covered in shallow cuts from the broken glass. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the sky. My body ached. My head felt like it was splitting open, and my thoughts were a blur of confusion and terror. Had it let me go? When I finally sat up, the aquarium loomed behind me, dark and silent. The windows reflected the streetlights, giving no hint of what was inside. I wanted to leave, to run and never look back, but something made me pause. The door, it was closed. Couldn't remember closing it. I couldn't even remember leaving the building. But there it was, shut tight, like nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought about going back in. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe my mind had twisted something normal into something monstrous. But then I saw it. A faint shadow in the window, just for a second. It didn't move like a person. It didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. I turned and walked away, my legs trembling beneath me. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though when I turned around, the street was always empty. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key in the lock. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, bolting it, and pushing a chair under the handle for good measure. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, every light in the apartment turned on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do anything against whatever that thing was. The whispers were gone, at least for now, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, pressing against me, wrapping around me like the thing in the tank had followed me home. Days passed, but the memories didn't fade. The cuts on my arms and legs healed, but the feeling of being watched never left. I quit the aquarium without explanation. Mike called me once, but I didn't answer. I didn't want to hear what he had to say. I didn't want to know if the aquarium was still running, if people were still working there, if Sarah was still inside. I just wanted to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option. The dreams started a week later. At first, they were vague. Flashes of water, shadows, and the sound of glass breaking. But then they became clearer. I'd see the tank, its dark, murky water rippling as something moved beneath the surface. I'd see its eyes staring at me, endless and empty, pulling me into the darkness. Sometimes, I'd wake up gasping for air, my chest tight like I was drowning. Other times, I'd wake up to the sound of something wet dragging across the floor, only to find nothing there. The worst nights were the ones when I didn't wake up at all. Now, I don't leave the apartment much. I keep the curtains drawn and the lights on. I avoid mirrors and reflections. They remind me too much of the tank. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it. A faint growl, so soft it could be my imagination. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just waiting, watching, waiting for me to come back. But I won't. I can't. I've thought about telling someone, explaining what happened, warning them about the tank. But every time I try to put it into words, it feels impossible. How do you explain something like that? How do you make someone believe in a creature that shouldn't exist, in a place that feels more like a trap than a building? So I keep it to myself. But I know one thing for sure. It's still there. Sometimes I wonder if it's just me. Maybe the thing in the tank never left the aquarium. Maybe it's still behind that locked door, waiting for the next person to get too curious. But other times, when the air in my apartment grows cold and the shadows stretch just a little too far, I wonder if it followed me after all. I thought I could leave it behind. I thought I could forget. But now every shadow feels like it's watching me. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.